Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Hello and welcome. My name is Alison Stewart and I'm your host of Cut the Crop. And we have the second podcast from our international speaker, Professor Fred Balow from the University of Illinois. And Fred has been over in New Zealand talking at one of our maize events. It was supposed to be a field event, but was converted to an online because of the extreme weather. But we're very fortunate to have Fred here in New Zealand with us. So welcome, Fred.
Pleasure.
So today, this podcast, we're going to talk about the 7 wonders of the maize crop. That's what made you famous, is, that concept of those 7 wonders. And it was originally, driving, whatever it was, I think a 16.5 ton maize grain crop. You've sort of got a new improved version 2 of that, which we're going to talk about today. But before we do that, unless people have been hiding under a bushel for the last 20 years, they should know what the whole concept of the 7 wonders are. But maybe just very briefly, for those few individuals that don't know much about it, just describe what the whole concept of those 7 wonders was.
Yes, so Alison, the concept of the 7 wonders was to educate growers and ag professionals, those management factors that each year can have a positive impact on crop yield. So we wanted to say, these are the factors that impact your crop yield, that this is the average value to each of the factor. And then we wanted them to think about making sure that they could optimize or at least consider those factors that impacted crop yield. And we came to this from a compilation of our research. We noticed, well, these are the things that we're always researching that impact crop yield, and we put it together in a what we hoped was a easy to understand concept to say these are the 7 factors. We were able to list them in order of importance, and we were able to give each factor an average ton per hectare value, and that proved to be very effective. But then what we realized is now, thanks to genetics and better management, now what the yield levels are actually higher than the original 7 wonders that came out 15 years ago. And so we've recently rearranged and rebadged it based on what we have learned. And I had the privilege of presenting a version of that at our premier field day.
So before we launch into the new improved 7 wonders, you also have a number of prerequisites that you like to talk about that is linked to that. So just talk about what some of those, I think you talk about 4 prerequisites for growing a good maize crop.
Yeah, and so think about a prerequisite. I mean, I'm in education, right? And you have to have certain prerequisites to be able to get into the university or to take a certain class. And that's the same thing is true of high yield. There's some things, but by prerequisite, I don't mean they're not important. They're actually crucial, but either they don't add yield or do not have to be done every year. So one of these very important key prerequisites is soil structure. I don't have to tell growers that they shouldn't compact their soil. Everything they can do to maintain that structure, whether that's a carbon addition, a cover crop. So this is a very key prerequisite. In the U.S., a key prerequisite is drainage. We drain our fields to maintain the soil structure. Think about something like weed control or pest control. Those don't add yield. Weeds and pests take yield away. And so by preventing weeds and pests, we actually protect the yield potential. Clear prerequisite. Now, the same thing is true when we take a soil test. We take that soil test. It tells us the pH, tells us whether we need to adjust that pH to make nutrients more available. It also tells us the level of nutrition we already have in the soil. And that provides the basis then for how we need to fertilize. So these prerequisites are crucial, and I didn't mean they're not important, but they either rob yield, or if they're adequate, like the pH or the salt test, then you don't have to do anything about it.
Yes. Okay. So let's talk about the 7 wonders. And again, important to put into context that we tend to be focused on, maize silage as opposed to maize grain, as it is in the US. So let's just go through each and talk about, what are the most important, and I know that you will see this, how they interact with each other, because that's equally important, that these don't operate in isolation. They all impact on each other. So number one.
Number one is the weather, Alison. And, we've been painfully reminded that by some of the struggles from the cyclone, both good weather and bad weather. It's the number one factor that impacts crop yield. Think of the different number of weather problems that we could have. Too much rain, not enough rain, hail, the wrong temperatures. Weather impacts when we can plant the crop, and it impacts the success of when we plant the crop. Some growers at least control part of the weather if they have irrigation. I mean, we can't completely control it, but we can control a little bit if we can irrigate and determine when we plant the crop. So every grower knows that weather is number one.
Yes. Okay. So what's next?
Yes. Then the next thing is fertility. So if you think about fertility, that includes nitrogen. We know how important nitrogen is, probably the number one element to crops, but it also includes all of the other elements that go along with nitrogen. And sometimes if you don't have the other plant nutrition optimized, then you decrease the efficiency of nitrogen use. So fertility is so important. Fertilizer use, number two. Now, here's where we start to think about these interactions, Alison. As you mentioned, all of these 7 wonders interact with each other. This is what makes crop production so challenging and makes every year different. You have 7 things that can interact with each other, both positively and negatively. And weather impacts all of them. Think about the availability of mineral nutrients, especially nitrogen. Every single thing about it is influenced by the weather. So that's a key example of one of these interactions. Weather's number one, fertility number two.
I mean, you have done work that is sort of like actually worked out the yield, loss potential from these. And those first 2 are by far and away the most important. I mean, if you're looking at, a sort of proportion, they're probably at 40 or 50%. Sort of driving from those first 2. Would that be right?
That would be right. I mean, when you rank something in order, number one has a higher value than the other. So you mentioned that we did a rebadge of the 7 wonders, and that's because our quest is for higher yield. We're looking for 19 tons. And, in the time that we originally put the 7 wonders out, that I think that occurred in 2008, now we're almost or fairly regularly seeing 19-ton yields. And so we said, well, we need to rebadge or rearrange the 7 wonders for 19-ton maize, because now it's clearly possible and we're seeing it more common. So weather's number one, worth 5.7 plus tons of the 19. Fertilizer number 2, almost the same value as weather, 5.7 tons again. And so if you think about those 2, that's a long way to meeting the 19 tons that we want if we have optimized and summed up the 7 wonders.
Okay, so what about the others then?
Yes, so the most important decision that the grower makes each year is their hybrid or variety selection. We're 3.1 tons to get the variety right. When we screen commercial varieties, well, that's the difference we see. And I don't have to tell you that some hybrids use fertility better than others, and some hybrids tolerate the weather better than others. This is an example of one of these interactions. So while not as important as the weather or the fertility, clearly an important parameter that growers have to decide. And they have to decide it every year, and the varieties change. And so that makes it a challenging decision.
Do you think that the growers are now taking into account, because often in the past when you look for hybrids or new cultivars, you tend to be focused on yield. Do you think that they're looking at resilience, and tolerance to, environmental conditions as a key trait now?
I think they are. And I think that there are some resilience traits that are worked into today's hybrids. I mean, there's some of the water use traits from marker selection that have been added into the hybrids. We learned yesterday at the FAR conference that you're trying to manage hybrids for different parts of the field that are based on their ability to use the available water. And I think we're going to see this change even more in the future. That we'll be able to develop hybrids that are more suited to dry conditions or to wet conditions. And that'll really help us add to the resilience. Some of it exists today, and I think it's only going to continue to improve, not only to the weather, but also to the ability to use nutrients if they're in short supply. And so I'm very encouraged by these kind of innovations. And I think it gives growers a huge new tool in their toolbox of opportunities to try and be more resilient and get higher yield.
Okay. So number 4.
So this is one I spent a lot of time talking about. And it used to be number 5, and I had to move it up to number 4 because it's so important. And that's plant population. I mean, as we spoke about in the earlier podcast, that's the factor that drives yield. That getting the population right is worth 1.6 tons. And one of the reasons that plant population moved up on the wonder list is we discovered we can actually manage higher plant populations by narrowing the row spacing. I know that's a huge investment, and I know growers can't immediately do that. But if you think about research, we need to look at what's going to happen in the future. And that advantage of narrowing the row spacing is those plants intercept light sooner, and because they have better plant-to-plant spacing, now we can manage a higher population of plants. And while not as important as the hybrid selection or the fertility or the weather, it plays a big role in yield.
At least you can control that as opposed to you can't control the weather.
Well, you can decide how many plants you plant, and you do have some control over what row spacing you're going to use. Absolutely.
So followed by?
Yeah, number 5 is crop rotation. In the U.S., in my cropping systems, it's maize or soybean. And every grower knows that soybean was the previous crop. There's a gain in yield from that. There's a penalty if you use maize as a continuous crop. Now we're starting to incorporate cover crops into our systems, and we have multiple crops. And so crop rotation plays a big impact. Not only does it impact the structure of the soil, the fertility of the soil, it might impact the pathogens that are present in the soil. And so crop rotation, it's a wider range, worth 1.3 tons getting the crop rotation right. I'm convinced that there's penalty from continuous monoculture. I mean, diversity is probably a good thing when it comes to living systems. And so crop rotation is one of these factors that can go either way, up or down. But growers need to be cognizant that the crop they grow before their maize can make a big difference.
And of course, that we're FAR is doing sort of a whole range of research looking at cover crops and the maize rotation to try and get a little bit of diversity in the system. So, what about the last two then?
Yeah, so I'll comment on the cover crop thing first. And that could really help with the continuous maize. When your cover crops are legumes that fix nitrogen, it's not like rotating with a soybean crop, but it does help break the continuous maize cycle, and helps reduce that penalty. Now, moving down the list, number 6 is tillage or no tillage. And when I talk to growers, they tend to be on one side or the other. Either they always till, or they're solid no till. And now we could do strip till, which I think is somewhere in between. Now, if you think about why a grower tills the soil or doesn't till the soil, it's really trying to impact the wonders above it. When we're in continuous maize systems in the U.S., we have a lot of crop residue, and we till that residue to try and reduce that penalty. Growers that use no-till, they're trying to get the water conserving opportunities that come with no-till. In other words, the weather. So the tillage system has a large impact on wonders above it. We give it a value of a ton. Now, keep in mind that these values all have ranges, and when I talk specific value, it's an average. But continues to be, the tillage system a grower uses continues to be a very important determinant of maize yield. Okay,
so what about the last one?
Yeah, the last one is this catch-all I'm going to call biologicals. And we talked a little bit about biologicals earlier, the living microorganisms, but there are also a whole host of biostimulants. And if you think about the biological market, or what a biological could do to impact maize yield, they can either relieve plant stress that by upregulating drought genes under dry weather, or they could make nutrients more available. Now, a very interesting fact about the biological component is there's a lot of versatility to how you could use them. You might have a biological on the seed treatment. You might have one with your starter fertilizer. You might put it in with your post-emergence herbicide, or if you're making a fungicide application, sometimes they can even go on the dry fertilizer. Incredibly versatile. We give biological category a 0.6 ton value. Obviously, it has a wide range, but it's interesting that the biological category is the only category that you could use twice or more than one of, and maybe get more than 1.6 ton increase in yield. In other words, if I could have a seed treatment and then I come back with a foliar treatment with a different biological, maybe I could impact the positive benefit twice. And that's the only category that you can do that with. So I discussed and I laid out all of these biologicals and all of these wonders and their value. And if you add up their value, you see that it adds up to 19 tons. So the key is to optimize each of those wonders to get 19 tons. Now, if they're not optimized, you're going to grow less than 19 tons. You might know that's easy. The hard part is to manage their positive interaction. That is the key to crop production. 7 factors interacting with each other. Think of the complexity there. Now, you don't need to manage interactions among all of them, but if I have a biological that helps make me more resilient to the weather, or if I have a biological that helps make nutrients more available, or that extends the size of the root system and allows me to plant more plants, those are examples of positive interactions. And managing positive interactions gives growers the opportunity to grow more than 19 tons. And I know there's a number of growers in New Zealand that have produced more than 19 tons. And I think you and I know the world record is, well, somewhere higher of 35 tons. And that shows you the opportunity to try to manage these factors that impact crop yield.
So what are the key differences between the Mark II 7 Wonders from the original? What changes have you made and why?
So in the original 7 Wonders, the number 2 was just nitrogen. We relied on the soil test for the other nutrients. And what we discovered is that as important as soil test values are, they're probably not calibrated to do 19 tons. And in reality, we probably don't want to rise the soil test levels high enough to produce 19 tons. That's probably not economically and sustainability. The economic sustainability of that is probably not the way to go. So we've now said through better placement of fertilizers along with nitrogen, we put fertility as number 2. We move population up the list from 5 to 4 because we've discovered it can be managed with row spacing. And then we changed number 7 used to be growth regulators, but now it's biologicals, which would include growth regulators because of this expanding market of beneficial microorganisms and biostimulants. And Alison, it's probably not done. My guess is that somebody, 10 or 15 years down the road, when our yields are higher than 19 tons, we'll have to rearrange them again in order to continue. The idea is that it's a concept, that these are the factors that we need to think about, and we need to be thinking about how they interact with each other. And I'm pretty excited about the yield potential that exists in maize that we can achieve as long as we have the education and know what matters.
Okay, so just to finish off, obviously our growers will be learning a huge amount from you. In your very brief time in New Zealand, is there anything interesting that you've learned about what we do?
There is. So I've learned a lot about silage maize production. I've learned that New Zealand is blessed with a climate that cool nighttime temperatures that really gives you the opportunity to produce high yields. I mean, you're blessed with the fact that you don't have some of the insect pressure that we have, and some of the disease pressure that we have. And I've learned, like everywhere, that New Zealand growers want to learn. Education is power. And I've learned from my travels that we're kindred spirits when it comes to maize production. We all know how important it is. Kind of gets in our blood. So I've had great conversations with the New Zealand growers about what their challenges are and how they're attacking them.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for making the visit, and safe travels home this weekend. I hope that your trip back to the US sort of is smooth. Who knows what's going to happen over the next week. And thank you to the listeners. Have a safe day on the farm and take care.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.